Good afternoon, everyone. I trust you're amped up for our final session on embedding electric vehicles for a sustainable transport future. I'd like to welcome to the stage Tessa Knox-Grant, Sustainable Transport Lead at Arrow, Dan Marks, CEO Bus Tech Group, Acacia So, Policy and Regulatory Affairs Manager at BP Australia, and Matthew Ryan, Head of Transport Emissions Reduction at the Department of Climate Change. So, why EVs in 2023? First point, they're just more visible on the roads. We're going to hit 100,000 passenger EVs in Australia this year. Secondly, as petrol prices hit, I think it was $2.13 in April 2022 last year, I think we're all starting to think about, is it worth making the switch to EVs? And thirdly, the government is setting economy-wide plans to meet our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, with EVs and transport being a part of that. CEDA looked at the state of play for EVs, and we feel we mirror the 2010s for home solar PV. We could be primed to drive off into the sunset and be rewarded with possible fuel security and other public benefits. And on that note, I'd like to ask each of our panellists, what are the opportunities for EVs in the years ahead? And pass to Tessa.
Thank you, Ian. So yes, Arrow is proud to be a sponsor of this event, and our values strongly align with creating a sustainable future, and it's great to be part of this discussion. We know the uptake in EVs presents an exciting opportunity for us to reduce our carbon impact and transition to a more sustainable environment. But we also know that it won't happen with EVs alone. To make a real difference, we need to take a more systems approach, to recognise the multiple factors and decision makers that create the complexity of the transport system. EVs are one component of the system. Private vehicles comprise one mode of transport, and absolutely a significant mode of transport that is currently pretty dominant here in Australia. Electric vehicle technology certainly provides us the opportunity to make a transition in how we use our private vehicles, and we can make a big dent in emissions if we get the uptake we need and we want and we're all working towards. But we also need to continue to provide other low-emission transport choices and really recognise the system approach. And we want to ensure we're using the emerging technology we have to make a positive impact. We need a system reliance and resilience for healthier, more livable cities. Some of the key components of this include things like policy. So how do we design our cities in a more integrated way to ensure transport and land use are integrated, to consider reduced demand for trips, to ensure that our walking and cycling infrastructure is safe and convenient and accessible for all, and obviously to consider the use of electric vehicle technology in our public transport and freight fleets. We also need to ensure that we're looking at the whole life cycle of fleet and infrastructure, design, manufacture, operability, and disposal. We heard a bit this morning about partnering and collaboration, and that's clearly critical to ensuring we get the uptake we need. Whether government leads through policy and incentives or industry leads through innovation, we're not going to do this alone. Coordination across government can enable the ease of use and interoperability of fleet and infrastructure, and we need all levels of government to work together to ensure that jurisdictional boundaries are not barriers, and that this uptake is actually easy for customers to use and adopt. I mentioned fleet, and we can certainly utilise the buying power of public transport, commercial and freight fleets to enact real change. And this goes beyond the emissions and the emissions reduction. If we can look to make the use of new fleet design more comfortable, quieter, more attractive, more convenient, we can help to shift the mode shift towards public transport and other uses that people may be less comfortable or may choose not to use because it may not be as convenient. And of course, we need to consider affordability and equity of access. We don't want our future mobility options to be alienating those who really can benefit from them, and we want to make sure that it's available to all. It's a really exciting time for the transport, housing and the energy sectors to be working together. And we need to do this together. Thanks, Ian.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tessa. And pass over to Dan. Do you want to go into the opportunity?
So I'm the CEO of the Bus Tech Group. All good? Yep. CEO of the Bus Tech Group. We're the largest Australian-owned bus manufacturer in Australia. We manufacture buses on both OEM chassis, but we've also designed and manufactured our own electric bus, which we've now delivered into Queensland and New South Wales. So there is a significant opportunity in the manufacturing sector to create a number of opportunities, both at the OEM level, but also through the supply chain. But in order to do that, there are a number of challenges that we need to overcome. To give an example, we recently were asked to provide a number of buses into a particular depot, but the depot can only actually service 3 buses. There's not enough infrastructure and there's not enough power to that depot. So these are two key inhibitors to the large-scale deployment of zero-emission buses. And this depot is not alone. This is a nationwide problem. Heavy vehicle transition, of which buses is one part, is currently somewhat of an afterthought. The buses themselves will not hold up the transition. We could supply 150 buses tomorrow. It's the refuelling and the recharging infrastructure that is the big challenge. Grid upgrades and the provision of reliable and affordable green energy in the immediate and short term are critical. Zero-emission buses and heavy mass transit vehicles are actually ready faster than the federal government actually anticipated. And the challenge with that is there's a lack of policy and regulatory framework, which is a further constraint. Passenger buses represent the second largest segment of public transport in Australia. However, it's a state-based procurement model, and there's no national plan. If we're going to get where we need to get to, we need to look at how public transport procured on a state-by-state basis is going to fit into a national policy. There needs to be a concerted and collaborative effort across manufacturing, government, operators, and the wider community, including the finance sector. We need to ensure that there are guarantees around demand to manage price and supply and demand and the supply chains. And we need to provide an environment where we can underpin confidence and investment in the Australian market. We don't have that at the moment. Failure will mean slower, uncoordinated policies and investments, higher costs, and the risk of shortages. To back up a point already made, we don't just need to focus on the vehicles and the infrastructure, but we actually also need to focus on the full public transport system. Through a transport-oriented and compact development of cities planning, the need for motorised travel and trip length can be reduced, giving people greater confidence in using public transport. At the moment, people don't have confidence in using public transport for a number of reasons. With every challenge comes an opportunity. We're on the cusp of, I believe, a mini-industrial revolution when it comes to EV manufacturing, and we have the chance to make a real difference across the community if we make the right decisions for tomorrow, today. Thanks, Ian.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Acacia.
Hello, thank you, Ian. Well, BP is aiming to become a net zero company by 2050, and we're an integrated energy company. We're looking at everything from electric vehicles, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today, as well as hydrogen and biofuels in terms of supporting the energy transition around the world. Our purpose is to really reimagine energy for people and planet, and that just means diversifying our products and evolving our services to meet our customers' energy transition needs. 3 months ago, our CEO, Bernard Looney, came to Australia and launched BP Pulse, which is our electrification EV charging brand. And as part of that, we're committed to installing 600 charge points across Australia, mainly focused on the East Coast of New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, as that's where a lot of the very ambitious, progressive electric vehicle policy has been to date. Suffice to say, BP has big ambitions in Australia. We want to build the country's most convenient and the world's most convenient, reliable, fast charging network and give customers a really good experience. As you know, when you're charging an EV, it does take anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes, and obviously we sort of have these chargers at our petrol stations. So we have cafes, toilets, all the convenience offerings that they need. The rollout of all these charge points and chargers will be mainly in key strategic metro and regional areas. And those 600 charge points is actually part of our 100,000 charge point ambition around the world. We've already, I think, across the UK, Germany, China, the US, Spain and India, we've done about 22,000 charge points. And Australia's got 600 of that, so does New Zealand. And so in total, that probably represents about 10 gigawatts of installed capacity for electric vehicle chargers. Now, some of the challenges that I think we will see, and I probably draw on a lot of lessons from our international markets, since we've only been here about 3 months in terms of BP Pulse, is we do need to see policies that are market-led. They are adaptable. They allow companies, whether that's EV infrastructure or bus companies, bus manufacturers, to come in to be a bit more innovative. But we also need the government to sort of come to the table as well. And a lot of these, what is a very nascent industry. And I was telling my panellists just outside that, we are in the energy transition now. We talk about 2030 as if it's a very long time. It's 7 years. 7 years from now, there's a lot of work to actually be done in this space. And drawing on some of the conversations from the first panel, some of the issues that, we're watching a lot of the different customer and consumer behaviours around the world about how they interact with their electric vehicle as well as the chargers. But at the centre of it, we need to allow customers to actually make their own decisions and have choice in how they want to be on this energy transition journey. And so they really should be at the centre of it. And equity is definitely one of the, and affordability. We talk a lot in BP about the energy trilemma, that's security, affordability and sustainability, and how we can actually make that happen for all our customers around the world, and particularly in Australia as we've just started. Thank you.
Great, thanks Acacia. And Matthew.
Thanks Ian, and thanks very much CEDA for the invitation. Particularly being a policy wonk in government and sitting at my desk, to be able to get out and about is always a pleasure. It is one of the highlights of my week, Ian, and the reason it's one of them, I was on a panel on Tuesday and it was hosted by the Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden. No disrespect, Ian. No disrespect, but you're a close second. You're a close second. Emissions reduction in Australia. So currently, transport sector, about 100 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent annually. So it's quite significant. It's number 3 after electricity and stationary energy. 2035 projection, number 1 sector in Australia. It'll become the number 1 sector in Australia. Something that needs to be looked at very closely. The current government, obviously serious commitments in this area, have announced they want to put out a national electric vehicle strategy that will address some of the things that we need to look at in Australia. And I'll talk about some of those as we work through the session. A couple of things to highlight probably with the challenge is when you look at transport emissions, the majority is 60% passenger light commercial. So that's a significant amount. Also rigid trucks, long haul freight, and some of those challenges with some of those other industries we've heard some other panellists talk about are certainly at the forefront of the government's mind. Probably the last thing I'd probably want to point out is this is not something that's going to be solved overnight, like some of the other challenges other panellists talked about earlier today. But we need to start to take some steps in that direction. And the government certainly understands that and is looking at where they can make the best investment to kickstart some of the investment that needs to be made across Australia.
Great, thanks Matthew. And my first question, I wanted to, again, another tangible I guess, target is that the Queensland government, the Olympics coming up, I was just reflecting on the 2,000 buses that they want to do, electric buses. I just thought I'd pose the question first to Dan of how do we get 2,000 buses in, I think it was quick maths, 9 years' time?
Start ordering now. If you do the simple maths, it's 250 buses a year over the next 9 years. And because of some of the challenges that we've highlighted, money needs to be spent elsewhere to ensure that the infrastructure exists so that those buses will function. And it just simply doesn't exist today. So there needs to be a lot of planning done very quickly around how we're going to get all the supporting infrastructure, how we're going to get the grid depot upgrades, how we're going to find the space for the chargers, and how we're going to be a bit smarter potentially about how we deploy buses. Because I don't think it's simply about replacing every diesel bus with an electric bus, because you're still going to have the same problems in terms of congestion, and you're going to have more problems now in relation to actually charging those. So we need to plan very, very quickly. And I don't want to get us to the position where we're 2 years out from the Olympics and the only way that we're going to get buses is to get them from overseas, because there's a larger scale demand overseas and we can simply order those buses and drive them off a ship.
Great, thanks Dan. And just on that sort of one in, one out, Tessa, I'd just like you to reflect on, I guess, the future of our cities, that can we just replace all the cars that we have on the road with a drivetrain that's electric? Is that sustainable?
I hope not. Well, I mean, demand for vehicles and population increases and everything are, there are more people travelling. So how do we, reduce the number of trips we take, the distance and the length of the trips that we take, and consider the modes we're taking? So it really is a sort of a multidimensional consideration. And there's a lot of thinking happening in that space. And I think COVID and the whole work from home thing and the whole sort of social experiment of us not coming into the office every day and the whole change to commuting patterns and all of that was really a real opportunity for us to demonstrate that we can reduce the trip length and still function as a society. And the economic benefits that had for the local economies. And so how do we kind of keep the good things of that, but still ensure that our city centres thrive and survive? And that comes along with all of that in terms of nighttime economy and a bunch of other things. But how we use our transport network, I think we need to get smarter with what we already have. So we've got a lot of existing infrastructure and services out there. So how do we use that more efficiently? Because obviously there's embodied carbon and embedded resources that are already there. So let's make better use of the existing infrastructure we have. But I don't think it's as simple as replacing like for like, because an EV, yes, it's powered differently and it won't have the same emissions, but it's still got tire emissions and it's still, built with a chunk of metal that comes out of the ground. And, those kinds of things we need to be mindful of, particularly when we're thinking of the net zero thing. So yes, EVs will have a massive impact in reduced emissions, but from a net zero carbon consideration, we need to think more broadly than just replacing like for like.
Great, thank you. And Acacia, I was just thinking BP's got a large existing footprint, so thinking about being smarter or adaptive with what we've already got, what do you see BP doing with their petrol stations into the future?
Thanks, Ian. Well, we are, as I sort of mentioned, we are going into electric vehicle charging, and we're offering both, electrons as well as fuel on our retail forecourts. And that's just simply underpinned by the core belief that, different customers, they'll have different needs as well during this transition. So we're not, at least in Australia, we're not limiting that choice. So if going into a petrol station, you will have that those options. We're also offering, obviously, commercial fleet. We're working with fleets in terms of their solutions, commercial solutions, and that's probably one of the things where I think expanding our network is going to give confidence to a lot of fleet operators, but also in terms of customers seeing electric vehicle charges and normalising it is a very important thing to do, particularly this industry is so nascent at the moment. And that's what we've seen in our overseas market. Overseas in the UK and Germany and China, we have, what we call giga hubs or big destination charging hubs, which isn't a petrol station, but they're strategically placed so that people can come in and out and charge their electric vehicles and go. In Australia, we're still learning, an EV is a car, so in terms of making sure there's a lot of behaviours that are still very much, I've got a car, you know, we'll see people rock up maybe with 95% charge already in their car, but they'll just want to top up before they move on again. And that's what's happening, at least from the 3 months that we've been operating in Australia that we've seen so far. So, and so far it's been really positive.
Yeah, some interesting dynamics there. And I'll take a question from Pigeonhole, and we can feel free to put more questions in there. I'm just going to ask to the group who wants to respond, is affordability or lack of charging infrastructure the key issue holding back EV adoption?
Happy to talk about that one. Both is the simple answer. So the government spent all of October consulting on the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. We were overwhelmed with actually submissions, over 500 of them. So that we've spent quite a bit of time reading through all of them, and there's quite a bit of detail. And some of the key themes that came through from that consultation were supply and affordable supply, absolutely. The thing that most people, if not all, cite are fuel efficiency standards in Australia and a lack of fuel efficiency standards. A lot of people quoted to us, we're the only first world country that doesn't have them. Even New Zealand have them. Russia maybe is the only other one that doesn't.
Kiwis are leading the way on this, I have to agree.
And so that sort of raised the shackles a little bit when New Zealand's got it and we haven't. Certainly a fuel efficiency standard, but they also talked about the role government and fleets can have in terms of adopting early and getting those cars through their networks and out into the second-hand market to address some of the equity concerns that we've heard, not just here, but in previous sessions as well. Also, domestic manufacturing. Let's do some more of it here. Do we go back to cars? Some people would say that, but others would say part of the value chain exists here. We have all these natural resources in Australia, these critical minerals. Why can't we value add in that space? There's real opportunities to increase our role in the global supply chains, but also in Australia, because we have all those minerals. And probably the other thing in terms of the supply was, let's not get ourselves in too much of a problem. Let's plan now for end of life. So end of life recycling. We've got pretty good programs for handheld batteries and things like that, but we need some more investment in those bigger batteries, and we need to start that now. Let's not wait for that to be a problem down the road. And probably just the last thing on the infrastructure. That was probably, in terms of infrastructure, one of the most important things that came through, that it's no use creating all this demand, providing the supply if you don't have the infrastructure. Good to see BP and others. And you know, ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, they've been investing in a number of projects to demonstrate some of the technology. Some of that's hydrogen, back to base for vehicles, but also battery electric as well. They've trialled certain approaches to microgrids and battery storage, which I think is important, again, an equity issue for remote and regional areas. How do you put the infrastructure out in the middle of nowhere, particularly when that's where the highway goes and that's where people want to drive? So some of that technology has to be invented, let alone being able to integrate it into the networks and roll it out in remote and regional Australia. And probably the last thing I'd say on that, and it does touch on some of that equity issues again, and I think the early quote was the solar on a tent. There's big issues with installing charging in apartment, particularly older apartments. One of the number one issues that pop up. A lot of people live in cities, in apartments. Yes, they might be able to charge at work. Yes, they might be able to charge on the street or in the car park, or if the business that they go and visit to do their shopping has it. Certainly they can, but we need to address the tougher ones that are in the city, like apartment buildings. So I think there's some solutions there with that energy efficiency, about the insulation, about how the load management works in those, that could free up some of that capacity to put some of that charging in, because that would be something that would not just deal with the infrastructure, but also address some of those equity concerns that people have.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And I'll just, again, to the group, I was saying, do governments need to take the lead in building charging infrastructure going forward? And even Acacia, perhaps you first. Is it, are governments taking the lead? How does private enterprise?
I think, thank you. Look, I think that in terms of EV charging infrastructure, I don't think governments need to be doing the building and owning the infrastructure themselves. I think that, you know, you're just crowding out private investment in that space. But I do think there's a role for government in terms of looking at, you know, identifying where we need more investment in our networks. So as much as I love to talk about EVs and them being in the car, one of the big determinants will be grid connectivity and network investment. That's just, you know, what we need in this space. And so the efforts in that space would probably be most welcome, and more efforts, I think, just going forward, particularly when, you know, at least from BP, we're seeing, you know, in our other markets, astonishing rate uptake of EVs. As soon as, you know, those governments are setting in these big signals, big targets, big ambitious targets, we're seeing people switch over really, really fast. And what's happening is there's big waiting lists, you know, in the UK still for an electric vehicle. So in that space, there needs to be, I suppose, a pragmatic, slow and well thought out ways to actually, you know, have the infrastructure and the cars together. They will correlate with each other. So yes.
Great. Matthew.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a quick crack at that. I think two parts. Yes. So the government's announced 117 charging stations to be rolled out over the next 3 years in partnership with NRMA, and that's addressing the main thoroughfares. So basically east to west coast, up the east coast, and up the guts through the middle, from Adelaide to Darwin. And that's because that's a backbone for Australia, and some of them are remote and regional areas. So on average, 150 kilometres. We've invested the government with NRMA to roll out that network. So yes, I think there's a role for it, particularly something like that that's nationwide and cuts across the whole of Australia. And the second part, I think, is just the enabling environment, the regulatory environment to enable the scale. So certainly top of mind for all ministers, not just Commonwealth ministers, state and territory ministers, about the standards, how you connect charging into the network, the different standards that apply across Australia, and looking to make it as easy for people who want to install this infrastructure to be able to get the connection agreement, to be able to have the same standard. So it gives that, I suppose it's that confidence for the supply chains to actually pull the stuff in, that they know they can scale very quickly. Because at the moment, it's very difficult. It's getting easier. Some states are better than others at it. But the sooner we address some of those things across government, the easier it will be to be able to scale the infrastructure.
Great. I was going to throw to you, Dan, to comment on procurement.
Yeah, but I think from a public transport perspective, government has to take the lead. I'll throw a bit of a political hand grenade out there. I think it has to think of public-private partnerships. I think this is less about buses and public transport and more about infrastructure. And large infrastructure projects need a lot of expertise, but they need a lot of money. The New South Wales government's committed $3 billion to transition 1,200 buses. So if you look at in a city, Sydney, there's 8,000 buses. So times that by 6.5, there's $20 billion required to transition 8,000 buses. That's before you get out into the regions. So multiply that by what's required nationally. I don't think that the state governments have the sufficient funds to move quickly enough to actually enable the transition on the timelines that are being talked about. I also don't think they have enough money to kind of picking up on some of the points about giving the supply chains confidence from a guaranteed demand perspective. I think there are a lot of challenges, and I think that there's a lot of impact funds out there and ESG funds that have the money ready to deploy into zero emission. And if there's a mechanism to somehow find out how private enterprise can work closer with government to push that out, then we should look at that. There are models that look at around the asset ownership and packaging together the bus, the energy, the charging, the infrastructure, rolling that into a fund and looking at that as a fleet as a service model. So we changed that from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. And that protects for a number of things in terms of technology upgrades, but also removes a lot of the risk away from government, but still gives government and the community what it needs and requires.
Great, thank you. And Tessa, I thought you could follow on that and broader transport planning.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I think the opportunity is kind of multiple-fold here. I think government certainly has the opportunity to provide the confidence that in the industry, and particularly in terms of the regulation piece. And that will help it make it easier for consumers to take up, because consumers, I think currently there's a bit of reluctance around the confidence that the technology is going to work, it's going to be reliable, there are going to be chargers where I need them, and the chargers are going to be easy to use, and I can use any plug anywhere, and the energy security is going to be there. But it also provides the confidence for the private sector, whether it's land developers or housing developers or energy suppliers or whomever it is, to take up the opportunity to provide the charging infrastructure as well, and know that it's going to meet the customer requirements. So I think it's a kind of a multiple-pronged thing. The government certainly, we can't wait for government to do it alone, but I think there's certainly opportunities there for government to provide the incentives and to provide the standards and regulation in place to make it easy for the take-up, both from the suppliers but also the market.
Great. And Matthew, I just wanted to ask about the question of equity and I guess EV models that are available. We see, like, as a recent KPMG report that had, its major inner cities is where the take-up is, but sort of in the outer rings, the take-up isn't happening because I guess the battery range or the models don't meet requirements. I just thought, thoughts on that going forward?
Yep. Thanks, Ian. Certainly equities, something that came through loud and clear through our consultation. I don't think the answer, like the people who want to access a second-hand market, I think is probably our best way to tackle equity. You'll see a number of incentives around each of the states and territories to take some of the pain away from the premium that's attached, particularly for the entry-level EVs. And when I talk about entry-level EVs, we're talking, they're still in the range of $50,000, which is quite an investment for anyone to make, let alone, people that can afford it. So I think there's a couple of ways to address that equity. One of them is obviously the incentives for people who are making that choice for a new car sale. So there's only 1 million new car sales every year, roughly, in Australia. I think 2021, there was 20,000 EVs sold. 2022, there was 40,000 sold. So we're going in the right direction, still very single digit in terms of share. But the more we convince the people who are making a choice to buy a new car and take away some of that premium through incentives to take that choice and do that, the better, because then they will flow out into the second-hand market and address some of those equity concerns. And also the infrastructure that we need to roll out to support it as well. So we can have a lot of charging stations around inner city where people have the EVs and can afford to have the EVs, but it's when we get out into the remote and regional areas, we need to solve some of those infrastructure challenges out there for equity reasons.
Great, thank you. I was just thinking about the second-hand car market and I guess also national manufacturing. Is there a role for retrofitting? Can we take powertrains and replacing things? Dan, is there a role?
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge?
Yeah, I think it'll be expensive. It's expensive for what you need. I think introducing incentives in the second-hand market and looking at imports is probably a better way to do it. There are models in Europe and the UK and they're retrofitting public buses, but they have to last for a lot longer in terms of how they're being used. So I think there is an opportunity, but I think the points that have been raised previously are probably a better way to accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. Probably,
Ian, I think something that's been touched on in earlier sessions, I think it's pretty important is the skills transition as well. So another equity thing, that there's jobs, there's a new economy out there, there's training opportunities. The government's invested in new energy skills, new energy apprenticeships. So I think there's some real opportunities there to get those new skills, those new workforces, push out into some of those regions that are close to some of these mining, value add in the infrastructure and refining that happens, create a new ecosystem of jobs and retrain as well. Is something we've heard pretty clearly through that. I think we need to be careful that we plan that well. It's quite a task, not just to have the infrastructure, but to have even the states and territories have the same approach to how they recognise qualifications for electricians versus mechanics, and them being very closely related. So I think there's some real challenges there. On the retrofitting thing, I've actually been lucky enough in a couple other trips I got out of the office to talk to some of the people that are working on that. The one I went to was down in Melbourne, and they were doing rigid trucks, battery in Australia. And I talked about him in terms of how do you ensure when you're selling these vehicles you've got the actual workforce that can support the maintenance. And he said, it's much easier. He said, less moving parts. He said, it's much simpler. You just plug the computer in and it pretty much can do most things and even order what you need. You don't necessarily even have to get your hands dirty. And I went home and I talked to my children and I said, I found the great job for you. I said, all you have to do is sit on your computer and you don't even have to get your hands dirty. And they all wanted to get a job tomorrow. They thought that was the best thing in the world.
Just on that, we do remote diagnostics for our buses. So we can tell you what's going on with the bus, why it may have had a fault, and we can actually pinpoint where that fault's been. And the people who monitor that are interns that we've got out of university. So the interns who are now doing software courses are far more skilled than a lot of the people who've been doing, let's say, traditional engineering or mechanical engineering for the last 25 years. So I think there's a real opportunity to actually focus from a skills perspective and make some of the stuff that the very, very smart engineers are doing at university more vocational and actually direct them into supporting this kind of industry evolution.
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, Tessa, did you have any comments on workforce of the future for cities?
Well, I mean, we all know that there are jobs now that didn't exist, 5 minutes ago. So that's a constantly evolving thing. But I think it's an interesting one, just thinking about picking up the retrofitting of vehicles conversation, because clearly the components, and I'm not an electrical engineer, and I don't really know much about the differences of how the engines work. But hopefully the generation of EVs in 5 or 10 years' time will be more similar to the current EVs that are rolling out now than the difference between the current EVs and the existing old generation. So there may be opportunities, hopefully, for retrofitting of the second-hand market once that becomes kind of older and more obsolete. And hopefully there'll be an opportunity in terms of the zero-emission componentry that second-hand market, those vehicles will be able to be retrofitted and will last longer. But I think certainly technology and how we use it is going to be increasingly interesting. And I think there are lots of opportunities in terms of reskilling across the supply chain and across the industry.
Oh, great, thank you. And we're coming up to the end here. I was just going to final comments, and I'll start with Matthew down the end. But also, firstly, do you own an EV or are you planning to purchase one? And then, sort of, any comments for 2023?
Good question. Final comment. So, I think the government very interested to sort of get on the front foot with the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. So, I'm anticipating, subject to all that'll be out in the first half of this year. But let's hope that comes through. There's still a little bit of work to do, especially with the number of submissions we received and actually working through them. And I think that'd be a great step. It'll at least give a guidance for everyone about what the government would like to see happen in this space and how they can support it. All governments, not just the Commonwealth governments. And I think it's recognition the states and territories have been first movers on a lot of this and have a lot of these things in place. So we're just having a coordinated approach to it, I think, would be very helpful. In terms of EVs, I choose to usually walk, run, ride to work. So probably make the choice not to have a vehicle at all.
Great, thank you. Acacia?
Thanks, Ian. Look, I think in terms of the role of government and policy, one, don't crowd out private investment, but two, let's incentivise business a little bit more. I think what the new federal government done has been absolutely fantastic in terms of setting out some leadership, but I would like to see a bit more ambition behind that, particularly around targets. The rest of the world has got targets, and what that means is they're going aggressive with that. The USA, in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing, EV car ownership around there is about 800,000, but with the new incentives as part of President Biden's IRA Act, that's going to triple. That's going to just go through the roof. And because of that, Australia, if we don't have ambitious targets, Australia's not going to be able to, we'd have to compete globally, and those supply chains are very, very difficult. So as much as we have great ambition, you will find that people will be on long waiting lists. So I probably urge the government to get quick on that, and hopefully we'll see a national electric vehicle strategy soon. In terms of whether I have an EV or not, I don't. I have a hybrid car though. I bought it a few years ago because the many hailstorms of Canberra at the time just destroyed 2 of my vehicles, but I only have one now. Thanks.
Great. And Dan, I'm assuming you might take a bus to work.
I've got a number of electric buses, just very difficult. So that's just for final comments. As a business, we're fully supportive of both federal and state rhetoric around sovereign capability and local manufacturing. However, as a private enterprise, government just moves too slow. And there's a chance we miss out on the opportunity to maximise local manufacturing if we don't move quick enough. I have some empathy with the decisions and the policies that need to be made and the money that needs to be spent to get to that point. But I do think we do have still an opportunity to harness the capacity and capability that we had in this country with traditional automotive and convert that into a new industry. But we need to move quicker than we're moving at the moment.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we really need to focus on how do we work more quickly together, share data, share the skills we have, share the opportunities that we have to kind of really make a step change in this. I look forward to the conversation that we have on this, no doubt, in a few years' time, and see if it ends up like we think it will. I think it's a really interesting point where we are now in terms of that we're getting to that kind of real live take-up. I think Australians are typically known as reasonably slow adopters to this, but once we kind of get with it, there's a quick change, and even in the last 2 or 3 or 5 years, there's been significant change. Just in the sort of awareness and uptake and willingness for people to become adopters of the technology. So I think that's really encouraging. I don't have a car, so I live in a one-car household, and I'm fortunate enough that I don't need to use it very often. But yes, I'm excited about the opportunity of my car purchase being an EV when it is time for that.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you're all interested in my response. I don't have a car, but I would love to buy an electric bicycle, a little Honda, and zip around. That's in my future. Matthew, if you could make that happen, maybe Parallel Imports help me out. But I'd like to thank the panel here for the really interesting discussion today. Tessa, Dan, Acacia, and Matthew. If we give them a round of applause, and I'll hand over to Melinda.
Well, I knew our time today was short and it was going to fly, and that's certainly been my experience sitting here at the front of the room. On behalf of CEDA, I'd really like to thank all of our speakers and panellists today. I've just been so excited and impressed by the ideas and insights that you've brought to the important conversations that we've had this morning. It's just been super interesting, and I just think everyone's obviously, thought long and hard about what they wanted to say, and it was really my impression of the conversation today. So on behalf of CEDA and our members, thank you so much for taking the time. Just one of the other things I wanted to reflect on is I've been sitting there on the Pigeonhole app. So many questions from everyone, so thank you in the audience and on the live stream for participating and putting your questions in. The flip side of so much of that is that sometimes the questions that you hope get asked don't get asked because the team up here are trying to construct a really interesting conversation. But I wanted to say that for those of you in the room, please take the opportunity to talk to speakers and panellists if you had questions that didn't get answered. But also just to let everyone know that what we do back home with these is we actually look at what was asked, things that we didn't get to lean into on the conversation today, and use that to either inform the blogs and opinion pieces that we'll put on our website or the next round of conversations that we'll have. So even if it didn't get answered, know that we keep an eye on them and we try to answer them through various other forums and formats in the weeks and months ahead. I thought there were just some really interesting insights, and I'm going to try to sort of pull them up a little bit if you like. Equity, efficiency, sustainability. We talked about three big sectors here today: energy, housing, transport. These are complex problems, and everyone talked about the multifaceted nature of those challenges before us. Overlay that with skills, overlay that with technology, overlay that with 2030 is the goal for so much of what we're trying to do. Really, really, really big issues and some really strong themes that I'm going to use as a little bit of a sales pitch, unabashedly, for what we're doing at CEDA. Each one of those conversations was really express about government, private sector, community and academia through big insights. That is our membership, and that is our strength as an organisation, where we bring these insights together across the country to try to move policy solutions in a doable and pragmatic way. Hopefully our members will have observed that over the past couple of years we've really been investing heavily in our own research capabilities and the work that we've been putting out for members and to the broader community and to influence policy. We're certainly getting a lot more engagement from the government, which has been really great, but we've done this with the support of members, and it's a nice segue to our sponsors today, Arup, Landcom and Siemens. Members like that getting involved in supporting these events, but also the research that we're trying to do, has been really integral to us being able to lift our research insights. So if you've got an interest in these topics, if you want to be a part of it, this is our bread and butter, this is our purpose and what we're trying to do. So please be in touch with the team and feel free to reach out to us and tell us what you want to be involved in and what you think we should be doing more of. So really big thanks to today's sponsors. It's been fantastic to have your support, not just in putting this on, but helping us to shape it. The final thing that I wanted to do, which is going to go completely off-piste, if I could put it that way, the one big policy conversation that is absolutely on the agenda this year, which we didn't talk about today, is a voice to Parliament. So I wanted to close on that, and I wanted to tell you where CEDA sits on this and what we'll be doing in the year ahead. Firstly, CEDA is a supporter of Voice to Parliament, and there are really strong reasons for that. First and foremost, a Voice to Parliament seeks to address a really well-known policy failing, and that is that for too long, policies that have aimed to lift the outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities have failed because they have failed to consistently seek and incorporate the perspectives and insights of the people for whom those policies are meant to have impact. And this is really well known. A Voice to Parliament seeks to address that really well-known policy failing. The other things that are just worth calling out is the Voice to Parliament came from a process which was Indigenous-led, Indigenous-designed. It's a comprehensive process that produced a series of recommendations through the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. The recommendations that were put are recommendations that seek to work within our frameworks of governance, not against them. They were designed with that intention. They're modest in the sense that they're not meant to be earth-shattering and completely transform the system, but to work with the system. Finally, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was an invitation to us, the people of Australia, to engage and to understand the perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I think it deserves that. So that's the position that we're taking at CEDA. We have on our website plenty of information already to try to help our members and others to understand the situation and the ask, if you like, and to understand the perspectives. We've obviously got a big agenda on this topic over the course of the year. I would encourage each of you to try to understand the issue, to talk to your colleagues and your friends about it, and to try to do that from the perspective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We will be holding events ourselves and forums to assist in that process. As I said, we've got information on the website, but if there's anything more that we can do for you to help you with that, please reach out. It is an endeavour to be constructive and to get to a point where we see a successful policy outcome for an issue which has been debated for quite some time now. So thank you again for being here today. Thank you again to Arup, Siemens and Landcom. For those of you in the room, we'll have a networking lunch, and for those of you online, thank you so much for joining us.